Hello YouTube, Sidekick here, with a little bit of a different kind of video today, because today's video is not going to be about flying. Rather, it's actually going to be about making videos about flying. Over the course of making DCS videos for the past couple of years, I've learned a lot of things about filming in DCS, or at least I've learned some tricks for getting the shots that I like to use. And I thought maybe it would be useful to pass a few of those tips on, either for getting better video in DCS or maybe just making it easier, because a lot of these things are not all that intuitive in DCS. So we're going to start. Here I am in my A4 in Cabaletti. I decided to use that setting, basically because it's pretty familiar to all of us if you follow my channel. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fly a quick mission. The sole purpose of that mission is going to be to provide some fodder for some interesting camera shot. While I do that, I will discuss some tips based on the way I use just the most basic cameras in DCS, and then I'm going to go back and film the same flight, putting some of those tips to use. So the first tip is going to be then kind of obvious, which is number one, record a track file. Now, track files don't always have the best reputation in DCS, and some people will tell you they're useless. That's not true. Now, some aircraft have more issues with their track files than others. I have honestly avoided making videos of the aircraft that are particularly problematic, because for the simple fact that I just don't want to present real-time cockpit video only, and trying to get decent external shots without a track file, not really worth the effort. So, I should also note, though, that I think things have improved lately. I'm having far fewer problems with track files in the last few releases of DCS. And I have also discovered a workaround for problematic aircraft, in that if I fly them on a server, the track file is usually good. And then it used to be that I then had to record the cockpit video locally, and then I could get the server's track file. But that doesn't seem to be necessary anymore, because if you fly a mission on a server, you actually get a track file that will allow you to view your own cockpit view now. So maybe the larger track file issues are also being worked on. If anybody follows the ED news more closely than I do and has some insight into what's going on with the track files, please feel free to share. Now, once you have a track file, you're going to want to have some basic facility with the various tools for filming. DCS actually has quite a variety of cameras you can choose from other than your cockpit view. Now, some of those are pretty straightforward, but some of them are a little bit esoteric, and some of them are, quite honestly, pretty much useless as near as I can figure. And for today's video, I'm just going to stick to the most basic cameras, although I can do more videos in this series if people want to talk about some of the more advanced cameras. For now, I'm going to deal with the external camera, often referred to as the F2 view, and the flypast camera, also known as the F3 view, where F2 and F3 are obviously the default hotkeys that switch to those views. Now, in addition to switching the actual camera, there are a number of camera controls that you can bind to keys or buttons. So, tip number 2 is know your hotkeys. In fact, in order to film effectively, I have not memorized the hotkeys. I have actually bound them to a bunch of keys on a one-handed keyboard, which is what I use when I do filming. That way, I can use one finger on my left hand for each important filming command, and then I have my right hand on the mouse for camera aiming. So, hotkeys that I use all the time for filming are the key to speed up time, the key to slow down time, and the key to return to normal time. The F1 view, the F2 view, the F3 view, the Control F3 view, and the Alt F2 view. I also have bound the slow zoom in and slow zoom out commands and the external zoom in and external zoom out, which is different, and that's also something we'll talk about. I also either have bound or sometimes use the numpad keys, which will control rotation, and I use them sometimes instead of the mouse. It's also very useful to know and bind the key for key repeat rate decrease and mouse rate decrease. Okay, the last two are actually very important because the default rates for both the mouse and the key repeat I find are really kind of too fast, at least for my taste. With the default rates, it's pretty hard to move the mouse slowly enough or using the keys to move the camera slowly enough to get those nice long cinematic orbit shots around the aircraft, so it helps to be able to slow those down. In my case, it also helps that I have a gaming mouse, which has variable DPI rates, so I can really slow it down that way as well. Okay, I think we've done enough here. We've come out, we've flown out. We basically did a turn, and then we did a split S, and then we did an Immelman. And I think that's probably going to provide us with lots of fodder for some interesting shots. Let's do one more turn here at the end. So basically going to end the flight here and grab the track file and go back to the beginning and look at some of the stuff we can do with external views. Okay, let's just start with some really basic stuff. Okay, so here we are back on the ground at Kobuleti. This is the F2, or aircraft view. The thing to remember about the aircraft view, you can see here I'm just panning around fairly quickly. The thing to remember about the aircraft view is that the camera will stay pointed in exactly the same direction regardless of how the aircraft moves. There are other external views that will track the orientation of the aircraft, but the aircraft view, the F2 view, stays stationary unless you move it, as I'm doing there where I'm panning it with the mouse. You can see that's a fairly fast motion with the mouse, doesn't make a great shot, but there's a bit slower motion. It makes a bit more of a cinematic shot. And then I can also actually use the keys. This is using the key to orbit around. That's about as slow as you can get it to go, though, which I think is still a little fast for my taste, but it is something you can do. Okay, here we are on the runway getting ready to take off. Again, we're in the aircraft view. You'll notice as we go down the runway, the camera stayed pointed in the same direction. And we can orbit a little bit. Now, the camera does do some funny things during takeoff in terms of zooming in and zooming out. I'm not actually doing that. Now, once we get up off the ground here, though, I'm going to show you something that I consider tip number 3, which is understanding zoom. And by that, I mean the two different kinds of zoom that we have. Basically, there are the two different kinds of zoom are what I would call a field of view zoom, which is what I just did when I zoomed out. And you saw that when I zoomed out, the aircraft got smaller, but you could also see a much wider field of view. So I'm going to call that field of view zoom. It's controlled by the external zoom in and zoom out commands. And it's basically what you would normally think of when you think of zoom on your camera. So that's what fully zoomed out with external zoom looks like. Let's take a look at what happens when you zoom in. Right, so again, the airplane got bigger, but the field of view also got narrower. There's less of the background in the field of view. Okay, so that's normal or field of view zoom, and it's controlled with external zoom in and out. The other kind of zoom is what I'm going to call dolly zoom, which actually doesn't consist of changing the field of view of the camera, so it's not really a zoom. It actually consists of moving the camera closer to or farther from the object in question, which is in this case your airplane. Dolly zoom is controlled with the slow zoom in and zoom out control. So let's take a look at the difference when I use the dolly zoom or the slow zoom in and out. When I zoom in, the field of view stays exactly the same size, but the airplane gets bigger in the center of the field of view. Let's take a look at zooming out. Once again, I can make the aircraft very small, but the field of view has stayed exactly the same size. And these two different kinds of field of view can result in dramatically different kinds of shots, so it's actually kind of important to understand and experiment with them to see what kind of effects you want to get. So remember, understand the effects of zoom. Okay, while we're zoomed out like this is actually a good time to talk about tip number 4. Tip number 4 is remember the effects of weather and lighting. The default weather and lighting that DCS will typically give you is a midday shot with really no clouds. This produces a very flat lighting condition and very washed out, at least for me, and not very interesting as a background. So as you can see in this mission, I have set it to a very early morning shot, so the sun is low on the horizon, and I've also put some clouds in to have a bit more interesting background. For instance, in this shot, you can see we've got some nice long shadows where there are trees. We've got some shadows across the ground because of the effect of the clouds, but also as we look into the sun, we get very different lighting effects. We also get very different lighting effects on the aircraft, depending on whether or not the sun is behind the camera or whether or not the plane is between the camera and the sun. So basically, it gives you the opportunity to have much more interesting shots if you set the lighting up so that it can actually be part of the shot to give you some different kinds of atmosphere. So don't forget about setting up the lighting and the weather. Try various kinds of weather. Try various kinds of lighting to get some effects that you actually like. Okay, most of those tips are really just kind of background tips about knowing how to set up and use the cameras. Now let's talk about some tips about actually doing the filming. And the first of these, tip number 5, is going to be avoid static camera shots. Don't keep the camera pointed in the same direction. Now, we'll point out that DCS provides a few ways to do this just natively. One of them is to actually enable track IR for external shots, which I haven't done here. But when you do that, it basically means that if you move your head with your track IR on, you'll actually be able to see that motion in the shot. And that can add some really interesting effects. I find it kind of tiring to film that way. At least the way my track IR is set up, it's just a little bit too sensitive for it to be comfortable for me to use it that way, and I just don't get the control I like. But it result in some pretty interesting shots. The other thing you can do is set the camera to either shaking or floating, and for what it's worth, these shots are actually set to floating, which does induce just a little bit of camera motion, so things aren't completely static. But I think that to make really interesting shots, you want to be just a little bit more explicit with the motion that you want. So let's take a look at that same takeoff, but this time instead of leaving the camera static, pointed in the same direction, we're just going to orbit the camera very slowly around the aircraft as it takes off. Okay, so here we are taking off. You can see I'm actually already moving the camera. It's not pointed in a static direction. Gives you just a little bit more interesting shot. Here we're doing the same thing a little bit later on the takeoff. Now, there's actually another thing that you can do with the Alt F2 key that we're activating here. And that is, instead of moving the camera around the aircraft, when we use Alt F2, we move the aircraft actually in the frame. So in this case, we get a slightly more interesting shot because now the aircraft is flying up and to the left, and so we've moved it to the lower right in the frame, which actually makes it a more interesting shot than simply having the aircraft centered in the frame all the time. So again, that's the Alt F2 key, and then pressing the F2 key again goes back to the original mode. So now the camera isn't centered, but we are actually rotating around the airplane again. Okay, now let's take a look at a slightly more aggressive orbiting technique. In this shot, the aircraft is going to turn. Well, it's going to be a right-hand turn, but to us, the nose is going to go to the left. We're going to orbit around to the right. So we're going to get a combination of the fact that the airplane is turning, plus the fact that we're orbiting around it, which is going to give us a really interesting effect as the world sort of seems to spin in the opposite direction of the airplane. So you see the aircraft starts to turn. We orbit around the other way. You can see there's a little bit of shimmy and shake because my mouse movement isn't completely smooth. But that kind of adds to the effect, I think. You get this very neat effect where essentially you're kind of doubling the rate at which the airplane rotates in front of the camera. It's kind of a neat effect. You can also obviously orbit the other way as the aircraft is turning. Get a totally different effect. It's really the kind of thing you just want to experiment with and see what you like. The key, of course, again, is just not to leave the camera pointed in a single direction. Add a little bit of interest to the shot by not only having a moving aircraft or aircraft moving against the background, but have the camera moving as well. Okay, as a final example of that, let's take a look at the split S maneuver. So once again, I'm just rotating here. I knew I was going to roll to that side, so I moved the camera to that side. I'm just slowly orbiting. Now, we get the sun coming in, so that gives us a chance to get some really interesting effects with the vapors coming off the wing, and the sun behind the aircraft, and so we're just trying to find an angle here, for instance, where we get the sun, we get those rays coming off the airplane. So you can see just moving the camera a little, you can get some really interesting effects. I'm just experimenting here, looking for different angles where I can get the sun reflecting. On this side we get the bright side effect because the sun is on this side. You get a little bit of reflection as the wings go across. And then we'll end with an F3 view as we watch the A4 fly past. Okay, so that's one run through using pretty much just the F2 technique. Okay, so the final tip, we're going to run through it here again, and the final tip is to use your F3 view, but not just the F3 view, to use the control F3 view to let yourself get some really interesting effects as you get the aircraft flying by the camera. So first of all, here's the taxi. Instead of following the aircraft as it taxis out, it's sometimes interesting, a little bit more dramatic, to have a view of the airplane as it taxis out and turns in front of the camera. So to do this, we can just use, the very simple F3 view. The camera goes out in front of the airplane, and then the aircraft is going to turn on the runway. And so we're going to get a view of the aircraft as it goes past us and down the taxiway. But maybe we want a slightly more interesting shot that we can't get by just relying on F3, and that's where the control F3 view comes in. What control F3 does is it actually stops the camera where it is, but lets it continue to follow the aircraft. So here we are in the F2 view, just tracking the aircraft as it taxis out, just like it did before, but this time we're kind of on the other side, which we can do because we've set it up with the F2 view. And we get just about to the point that it's going to turn, we're going to hit Control F3. And the camera's going to stop. And the airplane is basically going to taxi around us, which is a slightly more interesting camera view than the other side, because we've been on the inside of the whole turn the whole time. Now, you couldn't do that with F3, because F3 just picks a spot. And DCS decides where the camera is going to be set up. And here we are doing the same thing this time as the aircraft comes out to the runway. We basically let the camera go until it's in the spot we want, and then we hit Control F3, and then the aircraft actually turns around and comes towards us. And it's a slightly more interesting shot than if we had just used F3 and had it taxiing towards us and then turning away. Of course, the classic place to use this is on a takeoff run. So here we've moved the camera well down the runway with the dolly zoom, and we're going to let the aircraft continue until we think we're just about the right spot, which is right around, let's say about here. And now I stop the camera and I watch the aircraft go by, and I get it just as it takes off, and even get a little bit of the wheels coming up. So again, the F3 view would not have given us the same quality of the view there. It's only, we need to use the Control F3 to stop the camera where we want it to stop to get the shot that we like. Now, on something as simple as a climb out, we just use an F3 view, which is what I'm using here. But we can take a look at the difference that zoom makes. And so again, these are the external zooms that I'm using. The dolly zoom doesn't work on the F3. But you can see you get a very different effect depending on whether or not you pull back or zoom in as you do the flyby. So remember that you can use the external zoom when you're also using F3. Now, of course, the money shot in this whole sequence has got to be to try to get something really dramatic on that split S. And this is where that Control F3 is going to come in really handy. So you can see I've been setting it up here and trying to get the camera at exactly the right spot. It's taken me a couple of iterations going back through the track file to figure out exactly where I want to be. But I think I'm there now. And so now, as I reach this point, I'm going to hit Control F3, and I'm going to get the airplane to fly right by the camera and capture the top of that split S. Very nice. And now I'm just going to follow the aircraft around as it goes down to the bottom of the split S. You can see a little bit later on, we've done the same thing here. We've picked just the right spot Hit that Control F3, and now the aircraft is going to roll out and then fly right by the camera off the top of the Immelmann. And again, we set the camera up so we get the sun shining across the plane as it dives back to the ground, and that is definitely a money shot. Okay, folks, that's going to do it for this sort of basic edition of filming in DCS. If you'd like to see some more tips, please let me know in the comments. I can put together some more stuff. Hope you enjoyed that. For now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.